Hello everyone, this is Jack with the Book Club from Hell, and before we start this episode, I would like to make a brief announcement. We have chased meaning away. In its place grows the tower, always expanding and leaving blissfully fulfilled employees in its wake. I am a doctor who specialises in souls. A potent advertising slogan leaves ripples in the world of the spirit. Love is remembered. Maybe S was responsible for everything, but who else do I have? Blending Franz Kafka, Mikhail Bulgakov, Jacques Ellul, and Stalker Shadow of Chernobyl, Tower is a search for meaning in a world no longer organised for humans. So goes the blurb for my upcoming novel, Tower, to be released in November 2023 and available on my website, www.jackbc.me. That is, www.jackbc.me. Thank you. Jack.
Levi.
The Book Club from Hell.
Hello everyone, this is Jack with the Book Club from Hell, a Spenglerian accelerationist group seeking to discover a world soul's destiny, reveal it, and force complete actualization, leading to cultural exhaustion and death. In this episode, we're covering chapters 4, 5 and 6 from the first volume of The Decline of the West by Oswald Spengler. If you haven't listened to our first episode in this series, this episode mightn't make much sense to you, unless you already have an understanding of Spengler's ideas. If you like what we're doing, then maybe recommend our podcast to a friend, rate us on whatever podcast platform you're listening to us on, or, if monetary thanks is more your thing, we've got a Patreon account. Huge shout out to all our Patreon subscribers. You're helping keep this going. So, if you're still struggling to separate destiny from causation, then listen on. Enjoy. Yeah, approaching how to talk about Spengler is always difficult because it's just so interconnected, everything.
Yeah.
His approach to describing his philosophy is very much in line with his philosophy of
non-linearity.
Somewhat being, at least paying lip service to resisting schematization because it's inorganic, but then having a highly schematized way of viewing the world.
Yeah.
So I was thinking about this recently, how a lot of the people we cover, you can fit them all into this schema to greater or lesser degrees of success, where you've got this axis, you've got the autist schizo axis.
A classic, a universal axis upon which every single person in the world can be placed.
This has thousands of years of data behind it, but on the schizo end, it's sort of like the Ilona-Selka is the prototypical extreme end of the schizo pole of the autist schizo axis, where there's just too much meaning found in everything.
Yeah.
The barrier towards drawing connections between different things is probably a bit too low.
Yeah.
Another, actually, you weren't there for that episode when Ed and I did an episode on Level, the Flat Earth documentary. That's also an example of the schizo end of the autist schizo axis. It's an expansive, connection-laden approach to overlaying meaning.
Yeah,
on
like
the
Jordan
world,
Peterson
or finding meaning.
Jordan
within
Peterson's
the world.
definitely on the schizo side of schizo.
Yeah, he's definitely on the schizo end.
Yeah.
Whereas the autist end is more, I think, the Unabomber.
Sam Harris.
He's not the extreme autist end, but he's getting there. Where instead of extensive, it's very intensive. So you just you try to subdivide each
very analytical
problem and go deeper and deeper and deeper into it.
Yeah.
Where would you say Spengler fits on the autist?
He seems like he's somehow like bent the axis around on itself. It's now like,
because he's a superposition of both extreme autism and extreme
I feel like
schizophrenia.
He's bent and warped the axis, so it's now a Mobius stripped. And he's just walking around the entire thing infinitely.
There's extreme free association. Yeah. There's a lot of free association, but also it's very systematizing. So Spengler's interesting. He's broken the autoschizoid axis. Maybe it's a horseshoe. Like if you go far enough on both ends, they just come and loop back together. So it's actually not an axis, it's just a circle.
I would say that like the fact that conceiving of this problem as an axis is really an indication of the soul of our culture speaking through modern Western culture speaking through in terms of segments and lines and infinite axes.
How it extends infinitely in both directions.
And it's continuous, presumably. This is not an integer axis. This is a continuous autist schizo axis. You can subdivide any two people. There's an infinite number of variations between those two people on the axis.
Precisely. That's from the Faustian perspective. I imagine the classical autist schizo axis would have been just clean integers. So maybe a series of buckets within which multiple people could sit.
Which is, I suppose, in some way,
how would we map it onto a Magian cavern or an Egyptian wall?
It would also be superimposing our perception of linear time onto this different hierarchies and conceptions of the autist schizo axis in different cultures.
The autist schizo axis. Yeah, so I found these 3 chapters of Spengler easier than the first 3 because I'm much more attuned to his way of viewing the world. And many of these chapters, these concepts that he introduces in chapters 4, 5, and 6 map on to a greater or lesser degree to his distinction between nature and history. Not perfectly, and he does introduce a bunch of concepts which I had to think about quite a lot, like destiny, but it's more straightforward. None of these chapters were as bad as the Numbers chapter. Chapter 2
I think I said
of the first volume of Decline of the West.
At the end of last episode on Spengler, or maybe it was our last episode, our Dawn episode, I was dreading the idea of doing more Spengler. I was oh no. But I got to say, I'm kind of coming around to it now. I'm not how do I put this? It's kind of like reading. I know he's trying to explain the actual world, but I kind of get the sense that it's almost like reading the Silmarillion. It's like this fantastical, phantasmagogical cosmos that he's imagined. It's just the difference between Tolkien and Spengler is that Spengler was actually trying to explain the world. Tolkien was just having fun. But with that being said, it is interesting.
Last episode, I'll preface all of this with my only criticism of this book, or sort of the criticism that I have of all of the Decline of the West, which is why.
Yeah.
The whole thing is internally quite consistent. It's why couldn't it be different?
And
it's very easily varied.
Yeah, and I can kind of see when he's talking about stuff, I'm yeah, sure, that makes sense.
And having said that, I probably don't need to criticize it during the rest of the episode because basically everything I will say, when we're talking about the difference between destiny and causation.
Yeah.
My criticism, the primordial criticism I have of Spengler is the same. I understand what you're saying. It's internally consistent. I just don't know why it has to be this way.
Yeah, so I won't bring up too many criticisms throughout the episode. Suffice to say that with a bunch of stuff he says, he doesn't really explain it or justify it. He just says this is the case. And you're just okay, well, I guess
it is an inward necessity. It is an inward necessity, and if you think about it enough, you'll realize it's an inward necessity. I do like that confidence. It's a very necessity. Confident.
Yeah, or book. The self-evidence of the manifest truths. It's yeah. So essentially, with that caveat out of the way, once you kind of just say, okay, what if I just sort of let him have his say, and I'll just go along with it and kind of look past the occasional pot shot at Kant or Schopenhauer or whoever he's going after. If I just kind of put aside those things and just try to look at the weird stuff he's saying, it's quite a fantastical. What would you say? It's quite well, it's obviously mystical. It's very mystical. It's very fantastical. It's very yeah. It's kind of a
It's
weird.
really fun.
He's occupying this man's mind must have been quite interesting. He should have become a fiction author. He might have created something really interesting.
It's very free associational. Now, we'll talk about prime symbols and things this episode. So, what I'm about to say will make more context will make more sense in the context of having listened to the rest of the episode, which is not that helpful. It is fun seeing him just drawing all of these links between different actualities, to use his terminology, of different cultures, and then explaining why they are fundamentally linked to the prime symbol of their particular culture. That's really fun.
It's really interesting. In
Like
fact,
him drawing a distinction, or not a distinction, a link between cabinet diplomacy, orchestral music, and Gothic cathedrals.
yeah,
That's really enjoyable.
Yeah, and so one of the things I think would be really so my girlfriend said that so she's read, is it Foundations? This found Asimov's Foundation. Like, girlfriend's a big sci-fi fan, and she's read Asimov's Foundation series, which, if I remember correctly, has this like character who is able to predict the future of civilizations like thousands of years in advance or whatever. And
Yeah.
the civilization, like, I think finds like his writings or something, or there's like the Foundation is like this organization that has kept like his scripture alive or something. Like, I haven't read the series yet, and she was wondering.
Yeah, I vaguely remember. I read it a while ago. Isn't it on like opposite ends of the galaxy or
Yeah,
something?
yeah.
There are foundations which contain the sum of knowledge, or the necessary knowledge of the civilization that was known,
By the psycho.
that was predicted to die.
Yeah.
And if those would be found, then the dark age between the death of that previous civilization and the beginning of a new one would be shorter.
I'm going to assume that that's true because I haven't read it. I'm purely relaying secondhand information here. But my girlfriend was saying that she was wondering if Asimov was like maybe inspired by Spengler or something, like the way that
Spengler
is like trying to predict the multi-century change in civilizations using this like quite strange schema of history, like the psycho historian in Foundation. I doubt Asimov read Spengler, but it's still interesting.
He seems to think that if you know enough about the soul that is actualizing a particular culture, and I'll say lowercase c culture, not capital C culture in this case. If you're able to analyze it by physiognomically analyzing the actualities of that particular soul, then you can predict its future and you can reconstruct its past. However, what a soul's actualities will look like, or the morphology of a soul before it's woken up, is mysterious. So you'd need to know what that springtime culture was like to predict what it would be like in centuries or 1,000 years in the future.
Yeah, Jack fucking loves this shit.
It's really good. At the end of chapter 6, which was the last bit that we will be covering on this episode, he's talking about the difference between. No, he's talking about, and we will explain what the classical pseudomorphosis is, but why what we call late, I think it was late Roman culture, is not actually of the classical soul, but it's of the Magian soul. And one of the pieces of evidence that Spengler adduces to support this argument, or his thesis, is that the classical world used the chisel in sculpture because the classical world was of a soul which denied interiority. It was purely one of the surface, of a tactile, sensuous surface. Whereas the Magian soul was one of a cavern. It was in pure interiority that denied the exterior. And as such, in their sculpture, they used drills because instead of a chisel, which reveals and defines a surface, a drill penetrates the surface and accesses the interior. And when I read it, it just immediately made sense. I thought, yep, Spengler's broken me.
I think it's actually.
I can now view the world morphologically.
I think it's kind of like, yeah, as we were saying, like it's fun if you. It's weird. It's weird fun if you just kind of like don't ask why.
Yeah.
And you don't sort of like criticize.
Yeah, if
like, you just go along with it for the ride. I suppose you could say the same of like Evler and stuff, right? Like
100%. 100% you can say the same of Evler. As we've said in the Evler episodes, if you just accept that he sees certain things in a certain way and you just take those for granted, it makes sense.
It's also interesting because he's just full of
very similar with Spengler.
He's full of fun facts just about like different cultures throughout history. Like, I don't know if they're true. I'm going to take him as like a sincere actor who isn't misrepresenting any of the facts that he's presenting about different cultures through different times.
I just take him at his word.
Because I don't see what his motivation would be to misrepresent what he knows about different cultures. It's just kind of like what he draws out of that body of knowledge.
Nothing about Egyptian.
Yeah, it's just like, hey, what does he do with that information? He constructs this elaborate view of like the way that cultures exist autonomously of people and like all this sort of stuff. So it's really interesting.
Yeah, it's hard to see what he's trying to get out of you by saying, "Oh, well, 4th dynasty in Egypt was where the Egyptian soul awoke."
Yeah.
It was the springtime of.
He's not trying to pull one over you by like.
I don't like. Why would you be? What you wouldn't be trying to sell me anything by telling me this.
Definitely not trying to sell you anything.
It's a very elaborate sales funnel. First, you instill in someone the morphological view of history, then you hit him with the sales pitch.
Yeah. So I think on that level, he's perfectly trustworthy.
No, this is a very sincere attempt to understand history and human knowledge.
Yeah, really sincere.
Because
strange.
There's a lot of epistemology in here.
Yeah.
It's also about human knowledge.
Yeah.
It's just a really wacky system. I don't think he's a bad faith actor. I think he's really trying.
He's definitely trying. Like he's
gone off in a really.
He's trying
direction.
For like 2 volumes. Is it like both volumes are like together like 2,000 pages or something like that? It's something ridiculous.
In all, I think it's about 1,200. So I've got the Arctos editions. Here, I've got it here. How many is this? Volume 1 is 567 pages, not including the index and some of his tables. And then volume 2 is a bit longer.
So 500 piece, so over 1,000 pages of him trying to explain this stuff.
There's also a typo on the blurb of the Arctos edition for volume 1 of The Decline of the West, which really upsets me.
Yeah.
Anyway, let's talk about Spengler. It's a nice edition otherwise, which is why it irritates me. If it looked like shit, then I wouldn't really care, but it's otherwise really nice.
You're going to have such a weird bookshelf by the end of this podcast. Like, if we did this, did this thing for
it was
like
already pretty strange
for like 20 years, I don't know, like what's the longest running podcast? Like 15 years or something. Like, if we did this hypothetically, if we managed to fucking do this for like 20 years, just you're going to have the craziest bookshelf.
I'd be less concerned about my bookshelf and just the interior of my mind. The volume approach to assembling a worldview would be very, very much tested with that, of just reading as many different viewpoints as you can and seeing what happens.
Seeing what comes out. Yeah, so
weird fiction.
This particular episode is about chapters.
I transmute all of this into fiction.
Let's get into it. This particular episode is about chapters 4, 5, and 6. Chapter
6, yeah.
Yeah, chapter 4. Let me get up. Is about. It's called So where we left off last time was the problem of world history. But that's actually like a concept that he split into 2 chapters. Mm-hmm. The first chapter was about like physiognomy, and the second one is chapter 4 is the problem of world history, the destiny idea versus the causality principle. then the next two chapters
Yeah.
that we'll do, chapters 5 and 6, are about a problem that he calls macrocosmos, which we'll get into later in the episode.
And the way we're going to structure this is, rather than going through the book chapter by chapter, we're going to discuss broader concepts, because a number of these chapters will discuss the same concept but from a slightly different viewpoint. I imagine it's going to be easier for us to talk about this in terms of concepts, and it's going to be easier to listen to and to understand what Spengler's on about. Also, if we, rather than talking about what each self-contained chapter is trying to convey, if we just say, okay, this is, well, maybe not what destiny versus causation means, but this is how we interpreted Spengler's concepts of destiny and causation. I was really pleased when he started talking about destiny. And because it's Spengler, his idea of destiny is not what you'd really think it would be, at least at first blush. It's really good. Sorry, I'm a bit distracted. There's a cockatoo pecking at the window.
Yeah, those giant cockatoos down there with their beady eyes.
Gigantic white parrots.
Those things are huge.
Anyway, yeah. So should we talk about destiny?
Yeah.
Well, I'm getting leered at by an Australian native parrot.
So I've got quite a lot of notes here, so I kind of have to just like scroll through them and orient myself. So I don't know. Hopefully, if we edit it, like we'll take out if there's ever any big chunks where Jack and I are just like quickly reviewing our notes, then maybe that'll be edited out, I assume.
I can start off talking about destiny while you look for your notes, because I have an idea of what he means, and you can tell me if your idea of what destiny is different from how I've interpreted destiny. So for people listening to this, if you haven't listened to our first episode on Spengler, then a lot of this isn't going to make sense. Every living thing has a soul, and this includes lowercase c cultures. They've also got souls. And this soul actualizes itself into the world. And in actualizing things, it produces concrete things of being, no longer becoming. And this process of this living culture, of a culture living, this becoming, sloughing off, actualized being, that's time. So time is the process of that becoming, continuing, and actualizing itself. And from this, he's got this idea of destiny versus causation. And again, thinking back to the previous episode where we talked about the difference between the natural world impression and the historical world impression, where the historical world impression is one that looks at actualized beings, which is what we see in the world around us, and physiognomically analyzing them to work out what the becoming soul that actualized them is, what its morphology is. That's the historical view. The natural view, however, is one that only really arises in civilization. It begins to arise after the springtime or the summertime zenith of a culture, and becomes more and more apparent as that culture crosses into the autumn and then the winter of its civilization. It's a view which just looks at these actualized beings and then tries to draw relationships between those, how they cause each other in a scientific or a mathematical sense, with no reference to the becoming entity that actualized them. And we can think of destiny versus causation in a similar way. It's a similar distinction where destiny it's basically looking forward in time, knowing physiognomically or through a physiognomic analysis of actuality of what this becoming soul is, and from that, knowing what it's going to do in the future. So he uses the example of Napoleon, where he says that if Napoleon had died, for example, before he achieved the things that in our timeline he did, because of the underlying soul that had woken up, this Western soul actualizing itself, someone else, either an individual or some sort of movement of multiple people would have come about to continue this process of actualization. Napoleon's actions were actualizations of the becoming soul that was subtending Western culture. And within the context of a becoming soul, or a soul becoming and actualizing itself into being, you have individual wills, and individuals can act with free will. However, so this was interesting, his discussion of free will in the context of destiny. You can make some decisions, but the fact that you are born into a particular society will shape how you will behave. And I think even outside of Spengler, that's probably a fairly uncontroversial thing to say. So there's that element of destiny shaping how an individual behaves. But then also within a soul, a culture's soul, there are certain things that by inner necessity of that soul must be actualized. So this is one of Spengler's assumptions, that a soul, as soon as it comes into being, and we'll talk about the process by which souls come into being. Don't worry, listeners. As soon as that soul comes into being, all of the things that will be actualized are present, and they will be actualized in the process of time, unless that culture is cut short for whatever reason. That those things will always be actualized because of this inner necessity is destiny. And if one person or a movement doesn't actualize those things, they will inevitably be actualized by someone else or some other movement. It has to happen. This is to be distinguished from causation. So causation is basically looking at the being of a historical event, and then from that trying to work out which antecedent being, so which antecedent actualizations led to it in a causative sense. So, for example, you think about the First World War. In a causative model of the world, a natural model of the world, a mathematized model of the world, you could look at the series of alliances made by various European states in the lead up to 1914, and then you can have a look at Franz Ferdinand being killed by, I think it was Gavrilo Princip, being sort of the spark that set it off, at least in the, I'm sure, quite simplified version of events that we were taught in high school. That would be the causative view of history, of just looking at these actualities with no reference back to whatever being, whatever soul actualized them. So there's no physiognomy. Whereas the destiny view of it was that for whatever reason, within the Western soul, this massive war within Europe was inevitable. This was always going to be actualized. And if, for example, you didn't have various alliances or ententes being formed between various European nations, and then Franz Ferdinand being assassinated and that sparking it off, then something else would have happened because it had to happen by destiny. So that's the historical destiny view of it, of examining the soul's inward necessity. So that's how I understood his idea of destiny. What about you?
Would you almost say that the details that we might use in a causal account of whatever historical events or the changes within, say, a particular civilization or culture, almost they're secondary. They're actually not that important. So I think he gives the idea of the example of Newton when it comes to numbers is like the ideas that Newton had around, I know, like, or Lagrange had around the vector calculus. The vector calculus was going to become into being, whether by Lagrange or somebody else, or whether by, like, the ideas of Newton's theory would have come into, like, those mathematical symbols and those kind of artifacts of that mathematics were destined to come into being within European culture, whether by Newton or somebody else. and it's a historic. It's a
Yeah.
detail that happened to be Newton, but he was just expressing something that was in the soul of the culture.
Yeah. It's also interesting too, because that it follows on from that you approach evidence differently. And when I say evidence, that's very much of the natural or capital N natural world impression. But I'll just say evidence as shorthand, being someone living in the winter of late civilization. I guess I'm allowed to.
You're extremely biased here, Jack.
Yeah, yeah. Well, almost incapable of thinking otherwise, because Spengler is very deterministic when it comes to how someone is able to think. So, if you have a piece of historical evidence, so a corpus of facts, the causative worldview is going to regard those things as the name would suggest, as the effects of previous causes and the causes of future effects. Whereas the historical worldview, which views these things in the context of destiny, is going to, I guess I'm showing my civilizational bias here, at a capital C civilizational bias, in that I regard it as almost he's putting the causation elsewhere. So instead of these being events in the world that, in the same sense as agents within a physics system, can cause other effects, so they can interact with each other and cause some sort of outcome. Instead of these historical events causing each other, instead they seem to logically follow on from each other, because in the actualizing soul that gives rise to them, they're all inner necessities, and they don't happen in a sequence that seems to us logical because they are in the natural world causing each other. It's just because there's the inner necessity within the becoming soul that is actualizing these things. So he's almost placing causation elsewhere. But I get, like, I'm sure that's a late Faustian interpretation of it as well. And people will, I think we explained what Faustian meant last episode, but we'll go into more detail into all the various types of Pokemon that you can catch when it comes to world cultures.
So I guess I've got here some notes, and again, I feel like there's going to be a lot of this, like me and Jack going back and forth, being like, correct me if I'm wrong here, because I might have misunderstood. But
yeah.
And so it's the blind leading the blind.
I'd like to preface all of this, or sort of preface, by saying, if anyone listening knows a lot about Spengler or has strong opinions about Spengler and doesn't agree with or thinks we've mischaracterized something that he said, please let us know in Discord or something like that. I actually want to know different people's opinions on what this man was talking about.
So one of the people in the Discord, shout out to the Discord, corrected us on our mistaken mischaracterization of Rothbard's and the libertarians' idea of natural law. So we fucked up, apparently.
Is that fake Gamer Boy?
No, it was
or Dank Enlightenment.
No, it was the what's his name? I think he's called right now like Oswald Spengler or something like that. He's got the like Easter Islander.
Trent.
Is that Trent?
Yeah, it's Trent.
Yeah, the Easter Island statue.
Yeah.
I think that was who called us out. It was either that or anyways, one of the like ANCAP types on the Discord. Definitely let us know if we should definitely like find a libertarian or somebody who like explains what the fuck natural law is. But in this case, like, we're obviously going to misrepresent Spengler because, as I was saying before, it's the blind leading the blind on this episode. We don't know anything about this. Anyways,
I'm an expert on Spengler and I'm leading Levi through this book.
So I also have this idea here that it's like different cultures can have different orientations, or like almost like an emphasis. One being a culture that emphasizes the destiny idea, which is like the culture has like a sense of, I suppose, like a mission, like a cosmic mission that is fulfilling, and whereas like a causal culture doesn't emphasize like a sense of sort of purpose, but is more about like searching for explanations, like empiricism, that sort of stuff. And if we just kind of like pick a cultures to compare and contrast, favorite words from high school English, compare and contrast. Destiny idea culture and a causality principle oriented culture. Like ancient Egyptian culture was like a destiny oriented culture. They had like a sense of like cosmic order, and their entire society was like oriented towards like fulfilling that cosmic order, or like actualizing that cosmic order in like their social structures and like kind of everything they did. Whereas like maybe the Greeks or the Romans, maybe like the Athenians would be a more of like causality principle oriented. They didn't have like necessarily like a sense of destiny, and even though they still had like religion and stuff, they were more like causality principle oriented. And like current Western culture is very causality principle oriented.
This is where I'm going to have to politely disagree with you on Spenglerian terminology. At least I interpret it as, so in terms of how causal a particular lower C culture's worldview is more a function of the age of the soul that is actualizing that particular culture. I keep saying lowercase c and capital C cultures because it actually, at least in the translation I have, it's a meaningful distinction. So a lowercase c culture is just, it's basically the society that is actualized by a given soul, whereas a capital C culture is the actuality of a youthful soul. And it's within capital C culture that you have much more of a historical worldview, capital H history, one that's much more mystical, one that's much more generative. And then eventually that crosses over into civilization, which is where the soul is growing tired. We'll go over the stages of the life cycle in a bit more detail later, but you've got this period where it's sort of content and looking back with a bit of sentimentality in the autumn of civilization, and then in the winter, this culture has exhausted its inward possibilities, and for a while looks back, he calls it, with senility, and tries to recapitulate the forms of this particular soul's youth, and then dies and just runs out of new actualities. And you've just got these dead forms that continue through time until a new culture arises, either underneath them in pseudomorphosis or arises and just wipes them away. But yeah, the causation world impression comes about more within civilization. It's more to do with the soul's age.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Contrasting, for example, the classical soul.
Yeah, makes sense within the context of
it makes sense. The thing is, to me, it really does make sense. Like, that seems like it's a really clear distinction, but that's what happens if you just read Spengler intensely and take lots of notes on him. But the thing is, too, I'm sure someone listening will just disagree with both of our interpretations of this. And as we said earlier, if that is the case, please let us know what you think's going on here, because neither of us are experts on Spengler. We've just read these books. In terms of the difference between, for example, the classical soul and the Faustian or the Egyptian soul, is that he calls the classical soul ahistoric, in that they don't have a sense of time as this long stretch, this sense of distance of time. He talks about them existing in this continuous mythological present. So one in which, if, say, Julius Caesar died, so the death of Julius Caesar for us, for Westerners or Faustians, is a concrete event that happened a certain number of years ago. Whereas for someone of the classical soul, that death, as soon as he dies, he's mythologized, and that myth is always present and imminent. It's just always there in your life. And it's a society in which drawing ancestry from Mars, if you're Roman, is not ridiculous because Mars within the continuous ahistoric present is always there. It's this mythological present. He's always there, as opposed to the ancient Egyptians, which were a strongly historical people who viewed time as a corridor stretching. I'm not sure if infinitely, but at the very least, a long way back and straight into the future. And we'll get into Spengler's architectural analysis and things like that as to how he derived this idea. But within such a culture, they, for example, were able to know the times between which their various pharaohs ruled and things like that because they documented these things because they had such a concept of almost historical distance as history as a space within which an ordered set of events has happened rather than the Greek closeness and denial of interiority. At least that's how I thought of it. Does that make sense to you?
Sure, why not? Yes.
Spengler is just such a wild ride.
Like, I wonder if, like, you can say is it like how do I put this? I wonder if you could say that he might actually, whether or not it's true is sort of a separate question, but like thinking through, like, say you were living in Rome, like having the historical, like being in a culture where there is that like a different understanding of history and time, and like say like an emperor that was alive before you were born and died and becomes like deified straight away, it just enters like a kind of timeless realm. Like I wonder what that would actually be like. Would they wouldn't necessarily have the same sense of time? Like when we talk about, say, like the Romans, we have some sense of like, well, the Romans lived 1500 years to 3000 years ago, or whatever the time period was. Like we have this sense of like placing them a distance between us now and them. Whereas like I wonder if in a culture, whether it's the Romans or any other culture, where they had this sense of like almost like the past becomes just quite amorphous, that they wouldn't have had that sense of distance from the past. Like maybe everything is kind of the same distance in the past. It's just like the timeless past. I don't know.
Yeah.
Or like maybe things happened a very long time ago.
Yeah, because he talks a lot about how the classical soul was, how there's a sense of closeness and a denial of great distances in the classical soul, which I suppose is concordant with what you're saying.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think through like if that actually could be the case, that that's how people at least subjectively felt about their relationship to the past. Yeah, like I don't have an answer to that question. It's just an interesting thing to think about. The subjectivity of a Roman or something in relation to their own mythological past. So have we covered that idea enough? That distinction between the destiny idea and causal principle, or do we need to?
There are a few other things, because so the difference between longing and dread, we talked about this in the last episode when we were talking about Spengler's ideas of basically how history and nature as world impressions arise. How once a soul is separated from the world, it begins to experience a longing for that previous unity. And that expresses itself as a sense of time and a sense of becoming, but also the experience of time, of a soul actualizing itself, involves an experience of impermanence, because for Spengler at least, in the historical worldview, every moment is completely unique. So there's no abstracted idea of units of time that are interchangeable. And being unique, you can never get them back. You can never experience it again. That leads to dread. And this dread, to try to quell dread, we institute we mathematize the world around us. We mathematize the alien to try to hold it in place to make us lose this sense of dread or assuage this sense of dread. So causation and destiny also map onto this. So destiny is, because it is intrinsically linked to becoming, is also linked to this sense of longing. And so it's this sense of reaching into the future. Destiny is very much oriented towards reaching to the future in longing, whereas causation is very past oriented. It regards the past because it has to regard the past, because Spengler says that things that have being, things that are actualized, only exist in the past, because the very present is actually becoming, creating being through actualization. And so causation is fundamentally linked to dread and mathematics. That's probably the only other thing I was wanting to say.
Yeah, and it's very, again, like you're saying, like linked to like the life cycle of the culture, right? So this is like dread and causation principle is linked towards like late stage like cultures or civilizations, like the winter or the autumn. Maybe I'm wrong, but like, and whereas like longing actually, tends to be associated
from what you said there
with like the springtime and like art that is like inspiring, and the destiny principle is then like as the culture matures and starts to decline and become a civilization and like kind of becomes stagnant, it's sort of like trends towards a sense of like an emotional, like a cultural emotional state of dread. Is that no? Yes? No. Maybe.
More, maybe it's the forms of actuality are more informed by trying to dull this feeling of dread until you get to the point where the soul has died and you're only left with actualities, in which case dread is almost banished. All you have are these lifeless forms no longer made alive by the dread that a living soul or a culture soul would impart.
And is it true that, not true, but like, is it accurate to say that you can have like
caught yourself?
Is it accurate to say to say that within this idea of like the growth and life cycle of a culture and a civilization, that like a civilization can exist, or like, for lack of a better word, like a civilization can exist even if its like soul has died, and it can persist sort of like almost like a ghost or something, like a not a ghost, but like a shell just continuing to with this momentum of like artifacts being produced or whatever.
So the soul which gives the actualities their inward necessity is dead. And so the inward necessity being gone, all you have is really the causal effects of these actualities of a now dead soul influencing each other. We'll talk about it later when he talks about the evolution of art through the life cycle of a particular soul, how in the winter of civilization, once the soul has died, you start getting craft art and art fashions. So art is no longer determined by destiny in terms of this inward necessity of a soul's actualization, but purely in terms of petty tastes. And so the appearance of art starts to vary very, very rapidly through time, whereas previously with living cultures, it tended to be much more consistent because it was all being actualized in accordance with the inner necessity of destiny. Before we move on, actually, I also wanted to say that the purely causal worldview arises as a function of destiny. So, if a soul lives for long enough, it's going to die, just as a matter of destiny. And that leads to the causal or purely causal worldview or world impression. So causation is itself destined.
So but it's not caused by. It's a death. Like it's
It depends
by
what you mean by
cause,
caused, but
or it's just the inward necessity of like a
there's
culture persisting for long
an
enough.
inner necessity of a becoming soul that itself in schematizing the world around it as a mathematic, which is destined, which always happens, it will lead to a elements of a causal worldview. So Spengler does at one point say that you almost never get just a purely destiny or a purely causal or a purely historic or a purely natural world impression. You've got a mixture. But as a culture ages or a soul ages, it becomes more nature dominant as more of the alien is schematized with mathematics. And then I guess maybe it's destiny only exists within the context of a soul or of a great soul within which human souls exist. And in the absence of that, then you've only got causation. So he talks about how destiny is always anterior to causation because becoming is always anterior to being. But I wonder, at least the way he set it out, there are presumably times when a soul is dead and another hasn't woken up to take its place. And those times seem to be, if not purely, then at least predominantly causal and natural in terms of world impression,
Mm.
which it's chicken and egg then. It actually becomes harder to say which comes first because you could then describe the causal world impression as basically what exists when there isn't a soul actualizing itself.
Mm. Mm.
We
Mm.
need to talk to a Spengler scholar about about these specific mechanics. Is causation merely the absence of an actualizing
Or
soul?
is that like we've got some sort of bias in the way that we're thinking because we're trying to map separate cultures and civilizations onto a single uniform schema of history? Like, oh, the Egyptians happened before the Romans, which happened before these people, or whatever, where that's like kind of irrelevant that they happen to happen chronologically at different times in history. Or like in like the unfolding of like physical space time is irrelevant to like the rise and fall of like the cultural life cycle. Maybe that's our bias coming in there, like revealing us trying to map intercultural developments onto a single sense of history, a single universal sense of history.
Mm. Anyway, do you want to talk about time, space, and depth? Because those are related. Those are related concepts to this.
Yeah.
We talked about time and space in the previous episode, but as a bit of a refresher for listeners, while space is a concept, it's part of a mathematical schematization of sense experience. Time is not something that can be understood intellectually. It can only be experienced because time is becoming. It is not actuality. Time is the pure becoming of a soul as it is actualizing into being. So time is the unschematized experience of becoming. Spengler acknowledges that even naming this pure experience as time involves a schematization, hence why time, it's sort of just this word to suggest an indescribable experience. I quote, "The mere creation of the name time was an unparalleled deliverance. To name anything by a name is to win power over it. This is the essence of primitive man's art of magic. The evil powers are constrained by naming them, and the enemy is weakened or killed by coupling certain magic procedures with his name." So even naming time involves, well, it's what we were talking about earlier about trying to dull this feeling of dread of watching continuous becoming and a sense of inescapable change. naming time is a schematization of time. It's an extension of the natural world impression. So to even call it time is just in some way misunderstand it. It is the experience of pure becoming. Within the context of time, he says there are two ways to approach the nature of time, or two broad approaches, and one is that of the realists. And these people who try to imprison the time feeling and subordinate it by naming and schematizing it, which leads to the spatialization of time. So time being rendered as extension, which is abstracted. For example, physics time, where a second at one point in time is interchangeable with a second at any other point in time. This is compared to the idealists, those who contemplate becoming, and examples of idealists are people like Plato and Goethe, and presumably Spengler as well, although he doesn't name himself within this. Time is contrasted with space. I quote, "Space, object, number, notion, causality are so intimately akin that it is impossible, as countless mistaken systems prove, to treat the one independently of the other. Space is the world of extension, of actualized beings, and actualized beings as they relate to other actualized beings. So it's the natural world impression. It's not actualized being as it relates to the becoming that generated it. It's an attempt to fix everything in its place. And so I think that's the main distinction between time and space. And it's just worth saying it now because I'm sure we'll use these terms a lot later in the episode, and it's easier if people have a clear idea of what they mean now. Is there much you want to add to time and space? Actually, what was your interpretation of what time meant? Because I found the idea of space and extension easier to grasp.
Well, one of the interesting quotes I have here that is kind of related to that naming quote. So he said, "For primitive man, the word time can have no meaning. He simply lives without any necessity of specifying an opposition to something else."
Mm.
And so I think the main thing that I also have a thing here where he talks about like time being understood as a vector, so length plus direction, versus like time potentially being misunderstood as just like a length instead of a vector, without directionality, just like a segment. There's not. I don't know if there's a huge amount to say about it, other than what has already been said. He did also want to. He wanted to say that like the proper destiny and time are interchangeable words. Like these ideas are like linked, very tightly linked to him. Probably. I'm sure it'll come up again as we come back to it, as we like explore other things.
Yeah.
And space is space. I just have a thing here that says space is. Space is, whereas time is a discovery.
Good. It is. It's not becoming. It is.
Yeah.
But when you say primitive man, for Spengler, primitive man had quite a specific definition in that it's the state of a person before the awakening of a culture's soul. Because when the soul awakens is when you suddenly get this split between soul and world, or between proper and alien in a distinct way. And before that, it's, well, for people like us, it's unimaginable. But there's just not this same distinction between ego and world or soul and world.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting.
I think that's what he means by primitive man.
So then one of the questions that comes up for me then is like, is he saying that he's saying like the soul of the culture awakens? So the soul of the culture is not awake yet, but it does exist in some way. It's just like laying dormant. So is he saying there's all these souls that are laying dormant then? These cultural souls? Is there a finite number of these souls, or like, and why do they come in?
dormant, because I think he references the Russian soul and says that I'm not sure if it's dormant or if it's in a state of pseudomorphosis at the moment, but at least it's not strongly actualized, at least at the time of him writing this. He said the Russian soul wasn't really actualizing.
And does that mean that, like, maybe this is a question that doesn't make sense within his worldview, but like where are the souls, and like do they come into like being as like say like a people split off, say like some subgroup splits off, say like the Russians or something, like split off, and then like 1,000 years later, like the ancestors of the descendants of the people who split off are like forming their own culture, or is it like, is that like putting too much emphasis on the actions of the people? Is like, and can souls like, do they have kind of like mitosis, like when those populations split, does it like actually split the soul, and then the new soul can like have its own life cycle with the new population, or would they still be a part of like the previous soul or something? Like, do any of these questions even make sense within the context of what Spengler is saying?
Yeah, there are a few. There are a bunch of things there. So your point about where is the soul is one that I also was wondering about. But I guess to that he'd probably say that we are late civilization people who operate obviously with a very natural world impression. And as such, we want to try to locate things in space within extension.
And so then maybe they
And
exist in like a platonic.
A soul being an entity which is becoming won't exist in space. It's going to be something that is moving through time.
Yeah.
And I like you have a problem with this in that I think, well, what is it? I guess maybe. Okay, how about this? This is a very long bow to draw, and I'm sure Spengler would not be happy with this. But okay, so think about how information is spooky in that it can be the same piece of information can be physically instantiated in different ways, but the information itself, the thing that can be instantiated, it almost exists and doesn't exist, in that you can have it instantiated in plenty of different ways and it's conveying the same information, but where's the fundamental information that is being expressed in these different places? You can maybe think about a soul actualizing in the same way, that the soul in becoming is this information that can be concretely instantiated, or is concretely instantiated within extension. Does that make sense? Like, this is mangling Spengler,
yeah, I guess so. Like,
and Popper to try to smash them together.
Is it becoming? Is he proposing? Is there some sort of realm? Well, then I'm mashing Evler into this as well, because I was about to say, is there like, is there some sort of realm that's like impressing itself upon the changing physical space that we witness within, and that we like kind of phenomenologically experience as individuals within a culture? But there's this other thing, this other realm that's like impressing from the world of or just like the world of being in Evler's, but I don't want to bring Evler into it.
Well, he called it the world of being, which is un-Spenglerian.
Yeah, so like it's more like, but okay, so but I guess how do I frame this question without using like a geometrical or like spatial language? Just like, in what sense does the culture exist, and how is it interacting with the world of space-time that we see?
So the best I can do is that the culture exists in the same way that information uninstantiated in a physical medium exists.
Yeah. So at least in my modern Faustian understanding of information, is this like information that has not yet been instantiated in a physical form doesn't exist. And maybe there's a space of possible information, but to say that exists is almost meaningless. It's like, yeah, sure, there's a whole huge combinatorial space in which you
Yeah.
could configure any set of like physical components that you might call like possible information, but it's incredibly easy to vary. Like that doesn't really help explain anything. So whereas like in order to actually exist, like a piece of information has to be instantiated somewhere in the universe in an actual physical medium at least once, even though it has the property of being copyable between different instantiations. But I feel as though
Yeah. Well, I think right now we're finding the fairly obvious problems between information theory
and Spenglerian information theory. Okay, so if I put aside, I don't.
I want to make clear this is me trying to smash together two probably incompatible views of the
So
world.
maybe, but I even think that because information is like a physical phenomena, so originally like information was like a mathematical theory, and it was about like communication over the wire. And then as like it evolved and became like more integrated into physics, it's like less of a physical theory, less of just like a mathematical model and more of like a physical theory. And because of that, it's very like it's probably incompatible with the way that like Spengler views the world, because it's very physical. And and whereas like the idea of the existence of like a culture is not necessarily like a physical entity in that sense. So it might not be an information theory thing.
The question of where is the soul, I think, is almost
an incoherent question
within. It was Spengler, I imagine, would say, well, it is not. It doesn't exist within extension, because extension is a quality of actualized being, and a soul, at least the becoming soul that actualizes, exists as time, not as extension.
Here's
so it's almost just a category error.
Yeah,
You're asking for a square circle.
I think that's reasonable.
But I'm still unsatisfied with that as Jack the non-Spenglerian, but I think
it's a category error.
At least that's the best I can do.
Maybe it's like... No, I was going to like make an argument from emergence, but I think even that would be constraining the soul to like... But surely there must be like... Well, isn't Spengler is almost arguing for like a physics, or not a physics, like, but like an organic, a biology of the culture, right? So he is arguing that there's these laws to historical cultural development. So like he is assuming that there's these abstract laws that transcend any particular instance of a culture that they have to conform to.
So I get, so wherever, or not wherever, because that's using extended terminology, or the terminology of extension, of location, wherever. But because it's time, I guess whenever a soul is, that it's not a place, but that non-place has some sort of laws that these
Spengler,
souls
of course, understands what
perhaps,
those laws are. Can somehow,
within
understand,
or like within each soul, there are things the souls must do. Because when he talks about inner necessity or inward necessity of a soul's actualization, the souls are they're proceeding according to some sort of law.
So can I ask a follow-up question then? Like when he says inward necessity, is that... again, like I've been trying to frame my questions here like not as critiques, because we've already sort of set out a high-level critique. So I don't want to get too critiquey. But I'm just asking
we could
questions.
do it like you phrase it as critiques, and I can try to...
Well, I guess...
I can try
they're
to...
not really...
Spengler,
I guess they're critiques, but they're just genuine questions. Like... that I feel are just unanswered, or like just come up. Did this guy not ever get somebody who is critical of him to read the book? I think he mustn't have. He must have only shown it to people who just agreed with him. Because these are just like really obvious questions. Like,
I actually don't of Spengler's life, I'm pretty sure he was very solitary, at least during the writing of this book. So
You
conceivably, like
don't
he was just
say.
locked in his room and he wasn't talking to
Yeah.
people. When it was released,
It was really big.
it was very popular in that a lot of people bought it and a lot of people talked about it. So it would be interesting going back to particularly, well, translated into English, so German language translated
Yeah,
into
yeah.
English, discussion in the first half of the 20th century about the decline of the West, particularly in the 20s and 30s, what people were saying about it. Because I would be very surprised if our problems with it are sort of sui generis, and no one has thought of these things before. I'm sure plenty of people have met these problems. So it would be interesting to see what others think or thought.
So maybe, do you think maybe it was the sort of book that like a lot of people bought but didn't actually read? So they could just say like at some like cocktail party that, oh yeah, have you read Decline of the West by Spengler? Oh yeah, sure, why not? Yeah, it's pretty, yeah, like, whoa, yeah, the world's really like crazy right now, the decline of the West and all that. But it's like if they actually read it, they'd be like, oh, this is fucking
There might
crazy.
have been. I mean, I'm sure with any book there's one of those, but no, it does seem that people were really reading it and were interacting with its ideas,
which is good. So okay, so my question is like,
yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know what his editorial process was.
So my question is like, when you say like the inward necessity of a culture, like how is that not just something that you can say of any culture and just say like kind of post hoc, just like, well, that was the inward necessity of like what happened. It doesn't feel as though it's actually at all explanatory. Like you can just kind of hand wavingly say that of, well, it was the inward necessity of like such and such culture to come up with Newtonian physics. It's like, yeah.
There are a few things here. So Spengler was very confident in this work, but he did acknowledge in a few places that it's the beginning of
it's the Copernican
physiognomic
revolution of history.
So there are still plenty of things that need to be worked out. Yeah, precisely. There are plenty of things that need to be worked out, presumably by people who would come after Spengler. In terms of the explanatory model, I think he's at least offering the outlines of it. It's just that we don't accept his first principles. So in terms of the inner necessity, presumably later Spenglerian or later physiognomic historians would work out the, I guess to use a natural word, the mechanics of a soul that are the reasons why the soul must actualize all of its inner necessities in the course of its life. Why that happens, he doesn't talk about here, but being generous to Spengler, I think that's because here he was more focused on establishing this way of viewing history for people after him to then fill in.
And isn't okay, that's fine. That's fine.
Like when you say it's hand wavy, yeah, it is. Like
that's fine.
To look at Egyptian history and to say, and I don't want this might come across as dismissive. This was one of the bits I liked about the book and found very fun when he's looking at the different ways different cultures use columns.
yeah.
And yet, like, you can say, okay, this is a bit arbitrary to say, like, oh, well, in the classical temple, the columns are arranged as such to deny the interiority, whereas in a Magian mosque or temple, they are arranged against a wall to accentuate interiority and deny exteriority. And in an Egyptian temple, they are organized to eliminate peripheral vision and to emphasize a way or a corridor. It's just said, okay, well, these are actualizations of the inward necessity of the cultures.
It doesn't really help.
Spawned them.
It's like you just said some words.
Like you saying it's hand wavy, it's like it feels almost like a cheap shot for me to say, well, yeah, it is, because it just kind of is. It's like he's just decided that these are actualizations of an inner necessity. How does the inner necessity work? Dunno.
Yeah, because you could literally just say that of any instance of like a culture's like artifacts. It's just but anyway, I'm, again, getting too like criticky. Like how do you get an insight into, like, how do you understand the inner workings of the culture? the inner necessity. Like, how do you actually understand the inner workings?
So cultures have identifiable forms within them.
Yep.
And I think his project of trying to unify the manners, the language, the artwork, the architecture, the the way of interacting with other groups, all of these aspects of a culture is really interesting.
Mm.
And there's probably a there. I would be very surprised if, for example, a culture's plastic arts were in no way related to the music that a culture
Yeah.
made, to the language in a culture. That's a really interesting project. And I think that's a large part of what he's trying to do with the decline of
Yeah.
the West. And I don't think that's frivolous. But the mechanism by which he says it happens, that there is a soul that actualizes, and as soon as it is awoken or it awakes itself, it has these inner necessities that must be actualized. It feels like he's just come up with that without a mechanism.
Yeah.
And I'm just not sure why it's the case.
Yeah.
This is kind of
This is when you just ask why.
we probably shouldn't get into this too much, because at the start of the episode, this is just reinforcing what I said at the start of the episode, where all of my problems with this book are basically, but why?
Okay.
And that's kind of just what we've run into now. It's saying, yeah, but why is this the case?
Okay. I have a fun thought. I have a fun thought experiment for you, though. This is okay. I'm gonna pull back on the reins of the critique and the wait but whys. But but I do have it as okay. If I put on my neo-Spenglerian hat, Spenglerian, I'm a neo-Spenglerian.
Which you should be wearing all the
time. And I'm going to try to think through some of the consequences of if we were to carry the torch of Spengler's efforts and all right, we're going to continue this philosophical school of historical analysis. I think one of the consequences of what he's saying is it's almost, again, going back to Asimov and the Foundation series, could it in fact be possible under Spengler's understanding that if you continued his project to understand the inner workings of cultures and histories and stuff more, that there's actually an event horizon for any person who's going on this adventure of understanding the inner logic and workings of the soul of a culture, that once you understand that, you could actually bring forward all of the knowledge of that culture to that, because then you could say well, these are all of the pieces of knowledge that are the direct consequences of these the inner necessity of the culture.
Saying.
There's this event horizon where you could just bring it forward to the instance of when you discover the inner logic of the culture.
Yeah. Is it like a Vladimir Lenin, sometimes history needs a push?
Yeah. And so you could have these almost the foundations within each culture could get their hands on Decline of the West and Spengler's thoughts, and then commence the project of accelerating towards the knowledge event horizon of their culture.
Yeah. If we just assume that
Spengler is true,
wouldn't that just kill the culture?
Yeah, I guess so.
So if you just assume that you just immedially kill the culture. So you assume Spengler's true. So what you're saying is if the physiognomy of historical symbols is developed far enough, then you can examine the soul of a given culture, see what it will be. Yeah, see everything that it will have actualized or will actualize according to destiny.
Yeah.
And then could you, knowing that, then just actualize them?
And then wouldn't that actually...
And would that just kill the culture?
And then
because then everything will be actualized.
And then wouldn't that in doing that would actually be part of the inner necessity of the culture for you to have done that, according to what he's saying.
Yeah, so actually...
if you then turn it if Newton's
working out the rules of world history, does this fundamentally change the destiny of every subsequent culture? Or would they just not be able to understand it because we're Faustians and we can understand it, but whichever cultures will be in the future won't understand it. And so
Yeah. So that's a get out of jail free card. So maybe only these Faustian cultures can commit suicide like this.
mm, mm,
Because, like, okay, let's take his idea with Newton. He said, like, the fact that it was Isaac Newton is a historical detail. That idea was destined to be instantiated in that culture at some point. And so, if he's discovered this and somebody picks it up and then is able to, like, have this event horizon of the inner understanding, the inner knowledge, the inner necessity of the culture, and then therefore understand all the knowledge that will be created by that culture in the future. That itself, like that, you happen to be the neo-Spenglerian who did that is like a historical detail that's not important, but it was always destined to happen.
Yeah.
That's kind of interesting. Imagine that. Then you could have like these kind of like suicide squads of cultures within a civilization that might be like, like containing the
accelerationism, Spenglerian accelerationism.
Yeah, Spenglerian
should be a
neo-spaghettiism, accelerationist cult.
Yeah, neo-spaghetti accelerationism.
Yeah. Anyways, that was just a funny thought when I actually
there's a whole world of possibilities are opening up.
Because sometimes there's and I'm not going to go on a Popper Deutsch rant, but one of the interesting things that Deutsch does in his books is I call it the Deutsch attack in my head. When you want to like properly really do an effective critique of like a point of view, sometimes the best way to like critique something is just to take it seriously. And I was like, okay, what would actually be the consequences of that point of view? And I think one of the consequences of what Spengler is saying is that you could actually do what we just described. Potentially, unless I'm misunderstanding something. We need to read the rest of the book.
Yeah, possibly.
There might be some
I think that
like way in which like I've misunderstood something, or like because we're Faustians and we think this is possible, or like something. There might be some out. But
yeah, I reckon that's probably where he'd get you. He'd say this can't be understood by non-Faustians.
So you'd have to be,
and because we're already in the winter of civilization. Like our soul's already dead, so we can't accelerate our soul's demise.
So could this happen to every Faustian civilization?
Well, there's only one Faustian soul. Well, there was, because it's not around anymore.
Can there be multiple instances of the same type of soul?
No, I don't think so. I think they're all unique and particular.
Then how are there...
Because non-particularity is an aspect of...
How are there laws of organic development of the souls?
Well, presumably... So
they're
one
particular,
thing that
but they follow laws.
I think he said he was aiming for is that by looking at the souls of all of these different cultures, you might be able to... You can work out what the underlying entity is, because presumably something is generating these becomings. So what is that thing? What's this soul that's a step below all of these great cultures' souls?
Yeah. And is it then kind of like it's like a hydra or something? I don't know. Like, I don't want to use the word realm because, again, realm sounds spatial. Like, whatever it is. Yeah. Okay. I feel like we've gone way off track, and we need to like get back to the issue at hand, which is
what do you want to talk about? You want to talk about depth?
I was going to talk about
depth is useful.
Yeah. Okay. Do you want to? Yeah.
Depth took me a while to work out quite what he meant. I hope I have this right. So he talks about you've got three non-equivalent dimensions, because remember, we're working with becoming, not with being. In being, you can have equivalent dimensions that are just like degrees of almost of freedom for information. But in the context of becoming, these are non-equivalent. So for a soul, you've got length, which is moving through time, so actualizing through time.
Yep.
So you've got length, you've got breadth. Bit unclear as to what breadth is, but depth is really, really important. So depth is, you can think of it almost as this, it's like a mold through which becoming passes. So it's this sieve that imparts the sort of the shape of a soul as it moves through time. And it's that depth, that is what gives the shape to actuality from a soul, is that soul's depth. And that depth is what arises when the soul awakens. That's what gives shape to the actualities made by the becoming soul.
Jack,
I had a really hard time with this concept.
This is why we're friends, mate.
How did you interpret depth?
You're a fucking legend. The fact that you even managed to like get that out of your mouth is just like so fucking ridiculous. I have nothing to fucking add. I like, yes, sure. Let's go with that. I guess I have an interesting follow-up is like, how does that interact with like the artistic expressions like of the culture?
Those are almost the impressions of a soul's depth.
Yeah.
Actualized into being.
Yeah, and it's hard using is spatial. Okay. Again, not another criticism. This is not a criticism. This is a wish list. I wish that he'd just given like an abstract or like a summary of his thoughts at the beginning of each chapter. That would have been so helpful. He just said, "This is largely what I'm going to try to argue."
That's what I'm making in my notes.
And then he went on and gave the rest of the chapter because I just get lost.
Yeah, it'd be good if he. There are just so many times with this book where he'll use some terms which have a weird Spengler meaning, and then like 20 pages later actually explain what they are.
And this is through English as well.
When we talk about pseudomorphosis, that was one of the worst examples of it, where he keeps using this term and then only later he describes what pseudomorph.
Or he could have given like a glossary.
And it's not that hard a concept. It's just, if it's not explained to you, you don't know what it means.
He could have given a glossary of terms, and then it's made even harder because it was written in German. And then the English translators have done their best to like translate over these ideas.
The translator has done an incredible
really
job
good
rendering.
job.
I don't speak German, so I don't know how accurate this is, but I'll assume it's accurate. And the translator's done an amazing job of rendering this into English.
And oftentimes in my translation, at least, like if it's like a particularly difficult word, they'll put the German word that he used. Not that I'm going to look it up. It's like, oh yeah,
shout out to word. Konstantin von Hofmeister, the translator and one of the editors. What a name. Anyway, so how about this? This is very spatial, a spatial metaphor for what depth is, but it might help give you some intuitions as to what it is. So maybe, okay, you've got an artist, and pretend that the artist is in some way equivalent to a soul, right? A great soul that will then generate a culture. That artist will have some sort of architecture of their mind, a particular way of taking in sense experience and understanding it, and then rendering that into whatever artwork they make, into what they actualize. You can think of depth perhaps as that inner architecture which takes in the sense experience and then actualizes a piece of art. Again, purely spatial example, but that might help give you intuitions as to what depth is in the context of
and
the
is
soul.
It as a culture matures and declines, it loses its depth?
The way I interpreted it was it's almost like the depth hardens.
The depth hardens.
So as a culture,
you heard it here first.
Or as a soul
the dimension of depth of a culture hardens as it declines. Sorry.
Well, as it ages,
yeah.
So
it becomes like sclerotic.
It imparts an increasingly more systematized and mathematical.
Yeah, hardens is a good word for
actuality
it,
as it ages.
It starts off squishy and then it gets hard.
And so the depth is fundamentally a mathematizing or an extending property or agent, because it's born when
Yep.
a soul is separated from the world. That's the awakening of a soul, and that's the moment at which a soul begins to experience longing, which leads it to begin actualizing through time as it reaches forward, but also instills within a soul dread, which makes it try to schematize in actualization and hold things in place as these timeless, purely extended laws. And depth is that which gives shape to this schematization.
You know what we should do?
How about
we
this?
should.
I don't know if this is going to help, but I do have a quote.
Yeah. Okay.
So, from the moment of our awakening, the fateful and directed life appears in the phenomenal life as an experienced depth. Everything extends itself, but it is not yet space, not something established in itself, but a self-extension continued from the moving here to the moving there. And there's another quote: every extension that is actual has first been accomplished in and with an experience of depth. And what is primarily indicated by the word time is just this process of extending, first sensuously, in the main visually, and only later intellectually into depth and distance, i.e., the step from the planar semi-impression to the macrocosmically ordered world picture with its mysterious, manifest kinesis. Actually, as I'm reading that, that makes sense to me, but unless you've read this book, I don't know how much sense it's going to make to listeners. That's what reading Spengler's like. Reading Spengler is at first reading that and it meaning nothing, and then eventually getting to the point where you read it and it starts making sense.
I think I have to reread it. I think I'm going to have to literally go back.
I've done my best at describing what depth is.
I think I'm literally going to have to go back and reread
it's the
this stuff.
filter. It's the filter of a becoming soul that imparts almost the topology of actualization upon the things that are made being.
Is there a better word, or is there a better analogy than depth?
I don't like depth that much, but
maybe
the problem is this is such an abstract concept. It's almost what could you
the mana. The mana of the civilization. I don't know.
Yeah, almost the impression shape. But impression shape is spatial, and depth, I think, spatializes, but is not itself extended.
And where is Jack right now on the schizo-autist spectrum right now?
Yeah, this is both very autistic and very schizo
at the same time.
Spengler is remarkable in that he's joined the poles of the autist schizo axis.
I have a weird, I mean, obviously, like, as I've already expressed, have a number of questions and concerns for Mr. Spengler. But notwithstanding those questions and concerns, I have a strange sense of, like, respect for what he tried to do.
I have a lot of respect for this project.
Like, it's really weird.
Just for so many reasons, it's impressive because one, it's so ambitious, and two, the sheer confidence to come out with something this counterintuitive and to be so confident about it. To say it can't, he fucked up. He got it wrong. Aristotle fucked up. He was just too natural, too causal. But now you've got me. I've fixed it. Let me tell you about depth. Yeah, I admire that confidence.
And does he view himself as, like, he views Newton as a historical detail that's inconsequential, that this idea of the decline of the West would have arisen regardless of him writing this particular book, that these ideas would have come into actuality in our civilization. Presumably, he must have.
Presumably, because the book is quite consistent within itself.
Yeah.
So you'd presume so. It also depends on the particular world impression. So if you're viewing this historically, yes, Spengler he's an agent of destiny. He himself, if he didn't do it, someone else would have. If you're viewing this naturally, then Spengler caused this and probably, yeah, he would be more celebrated within a natural world impression than a historical one. So it depends which of those world impressions Spengler would bring to bear upon himself.
And then is that in that case, because he's predicting certain things to happen in the next few hundred years, does that mean that it's really like the culture is making predictions about itself, and it's actually it's almost like speaking to the inhabitants of its own?
Yeah. It would be consistent with when we go into the specifics of, for example, the Faustian soul. This will make more sense. But
yeah,
if the Faustian soul is as he describes, then that reaching for infinity or becoming aware of its own destiny would be consistent.
it's like the Faustian soul is understanding cultural souls as such, including itself.
Yeah, as it reaches for infinity.
That's pretty cool. I actually like that idea.
Yeah.
Like it's pretty wacky. I think this is like grand. Like this is like, yeah. I think you could legitimately use this as like a way of like creating like a fiction video game of some sort, or like a fiction novel, like having some sort of schema.
Can you imagine trying to sell someone on lore directly inspired by Spengler, though? How many problems people would have trying to work out the cosmology of your 200-hour CRPG based on Spengler talking about souls and prime symbols.
I imagine it'd be something like Dwarf Fortress, you know? Like,
yeah, that's true.
Yeah. That'd be really good. Or maybe like
good,
Baldur's Gate, something like that, where you're trying to like find the Spengler Foundation that's trying to discover all the inner necessity of the culture and destroy the world, and you're trying to stop them from working out the inner
You're
logic.
trying to discover the 2 volumes of The Decline of the West. You're questing across the Sword Coast to find the Decline of the West.
Yeah. Anyways, what's some other interesting? I have some other interesting ideas down here.
Prime phenomena and prime symbols. Oh, wait, what were you going to say?
I actually think that's a bit. I think prime phenomena and prime symbols is better than what I was going to say. I was going to say, like, actually, let's talk about Apollonian, Faustian, and Magian, but I think that would be better to come after a discussion of primary symbols.
Yeah. Let's do prime symbol, and then what the different souls look like, because also that'll be really fun. But prime symbols is good because it follows on from depth, because so you got a culture's soul, and once it awakens, it experiences the world as depth. So again, depth as this filter that shapes pure sense experience or pure experience and gives shape to the actualities actualized by a becoming soul. And the structure of depth is a culture's prime symbol. How experience is schematized into extension. Now, when Spengler says what the prime symbol of a culture is, it's almost it should be very much be taken as a symbol. So the depth experience of, for example, an Egyptian is not literally the way. It's not literally a corridor, but that thinking about the shape of the symbol almost gives you an idea of what, in a non-extended, purely time sense, this depth looks like, or this depth is. I've got a quote. Thus, the destiny idea manifests itself in every line of a life, With it alone do we become members of a particular culture, whose members are connected by a common world feeling and a common world form derived from it. A deep identity unites the awakening of the soul, its birth into clear existence in the name of a culture, with the sudden realization of distance and time, the birth of its outer world through the symbol of extension, and thenceforth this symbol is and remains the prime symbol of that life, imparting to its specific style and the historical form in which it progressively actualizes its inward possibilities. So, if depth is almost this mold of of things that are made extended, the prime symbol is kind of the shape of that mold. It's what unites all of the actualities of a soul. And the prime symbol itself is not actualized, but is operative through the actualities of a culture. And this is why you can examine
Should
it.
we give some examples?
Yeah. Okay, so the classical soul or the Apollonian soul, the prime symbol is the close, self-limited and self-contained body without an interior. So the surface of a self-limited body. And this is manifested in many ways. So in the previous episode, we talked about mathematics of different cultures. So classical Euclidean mathematics are of defined magnitudes in comparison to each other, and it's one without bodiless things like negative numbers or things which are not complete bodies like things that don't fit neatly into complete bodies like irrational numbers. In terms of sculpture, it's very much, he says, sculpture of the surface as compared to Faustian plastic arts, which tends to emphasize light and shade using colors on a canvas. The architecture of this soul is one of, for example, a temple where the columns deny the interior. The interior is continuous with the exterior. Everything is an exterior surface in the classical temple architecture. In terms of their astronomy, they denied any, they call it sort of unformed chaos outside of the neatly organized and near cosmos. In terms of political organization, it was these small, self-contained city states which could almost be taken in at once, like the surface of a sculpture, as opposed to Western cultures where you have these sprawling bureaucratic states which can't be taken in as a single surface. That's at least my sense of the classical. Actually, it's interesting. He talks about tragedy a lot, the different forms of tragedy in different cultures, and how classical tragedy, because the classical soul is ahistoric, it takes in history as a single static surface, as opposed to the Faustian history, which is much more related to the function, sort of the Faustian mathematical function. This thing that is continuous, always changing, it can always generate outputs rather than being a single self-contained entity. Classical tragedy tends to be that of almost accidents or accidental circumstances which aren't related to the internal development of the people within the tragedy. Whereas Faustian tragedy is about the inner development according to destiny, tragically leading to an outcome. So, do you have more to add about the classical soul?
No, I do have one question though. Like, how much did this person read? Like, he must have just been
A lot.
reading.
I'm sure he read
all the
lot.
time. Like, to have some working knowledge of just like, say, Hellenic culture or whatever, like ancient Greece or whatever, would have been quite a bit of reading. But I mean, assuming that he did read enough to substantiate his claims, this is like across like quite a lot of stuff. He's across a lot.
Yeah.
I'm just going to note that I think that's incredibly impressive. What did he do with his time?
The project of the Decline of the West is amazing. The amount of scholarship that went into it.
Yeah. No, I don't think so. So like,
here's another thing. How with their theology or their supernatural world of the classical soul, how they are very human gods existing in a concrete place on Mount Olympus. So again, it's self-contained and concrete, as opposed to so the Magian Arabian prime symbol is that of the cavern, and he says that Magian monotheism is of a piece with that because within the cavern, so Magian space is such that it's a location, a non-integer location within the context of a cavern, and he says monotheism is consistent with that because it is a single cavern, and it's dematerialized and emphasizes the interior, as opposed to the classical soul, which is concrete and emphasizes the exterior and concrete integers. Hence, why you have a polytheism existing on a concrete Mount Olympus. What about the Western and Faustian soul? I need to go to the bathroom. Can you talk about the Western soul while I go and do that?
So the Western soul is. I have as I mentioned in the last episode, I have a symbol of infinity on my on one of my wrists, and one of my favorite books is The Beginning of Infinity. So the Western soul, or the Faustian soul, I should say, is I suppose obsessed with, or obsessed with, or particularly interested in the infinite, the transcendent. There's a sense of upward striving and yearning. Some of the things that reflect this inclination towards the infinite are things like the Gothic cathedral, like Chartres Cathedral in France. What other examples does he give? The transcendence of like stained glass windows. Jack, you're back. I'm lacking so much confidence in what I'm saying.
I'm back.
I just have zero confidence in my representation.
Infinite space.
So I say like the Faustian soul is like an obsession with the infinite and the transcendent. So, and then looking at like different, what would you say, like becomings or like cultural motifs of, or not, instantiations of of that soul type.
Actualizations.
Yeah, actualizations. There we go.
Yeah. The Faustian soul is one that reaches for infinity and is innately tragic because on some level it knows it will never reach infinity.
That's a good point. That's an innate tragedy.
Intrinsic.
I think. Yeah, that's a good point.
Innate to this desire to reach infinity is an attempt at bodilessness. So how about we go through the different ways in which this is actualized. So for example, the instrumental music of the Faustian soul is very, very important to the Faustian soul. So these different art forms have differing degrees of importance to different souls. So for example, for the Egyptians, stonework and architecture was the most important art form for them. And they didn't develop, we'll go into what ornamentation is later, but they didn't develop an ornamentation separate from their architecture to a very great extent. Their soul really actualized itself in generating these stone corridors or stone symbols of direction upon the landscape. Faustian art tended to manifest itself, or the art forms that Faustian art most potently actualized as tended to be things like music, where it's this bodiless, continuous sound. He found chamber music actually particularly important. It's this, you think of a bowed stringed instrument, it's a continuous noise. And if someone is very, very good, you sometimes have, and especially if they're playing in a group, you have a hard time hearing the individual moments when someone changes from, say, an up bow to a down bow or a down bow to an up bow. It's a continuous, infinite sound. And if you think about the Faustian mathematic, it's one within which between two integers there are an infinite number of points. And so within a single bow or that continuous noise,
Yeah, you have
of,
both the
say,
the continuum
of chamber music or Beethoven's last works, you've got infinity contained within it. He also uses the example of stained glass in Faustian cathedrals, which are very, very physiognomically rich actualities. How so the cathedral itself, he says, is orienting upwards. So you've got arches with a pointed top, and so the arches, they rise from the ground and meet this pointed top, which is directing towards infinity. The architecture of the entire cathedrals are very high, have high roofs, but also the ornamentation of the architecture itself is also pointing upwards to infinity through the roof. And then one of the most physiognomically powerful symbols in the cathedral is stained glass. How you've got painting with light with this. I know it's not, physics sense immaterial, but it's this, in a Spenglerian sense, this immaterial painting, a bodiless painting.
Yeah.
That frees one from bodilessness, which allows for infinity. There's so much stuff. It's, as we talked about last time, classical mathematics versus Faustian mathematics, how Faustian mathematics is defined by the function. So you can have, for example, a circular function like a sine wave, like sine x, that goes forever. You just keep putting in different values for x, it never stops. Another example of infinity, which for classical people, it's Spengler. I've already prefaced all of this with, I don't know if this is actually the case, but he says so. They just wouldn't be able to understand that. It, to them, would just be, at best, meaningless, at worst, an invitation for chaos to invade cosmos and destroy everything. Yeah, there's so much. These bits of the book have been my favorites so far, where he's just information dumping. He's lore dumping you with all of these different things that are actualities of these different souls. He's got a good bit comparing the Magian and Faustian windows. I don't mean this metaphorically. He's just, for a paragraph, he's just talking about how these two souls use windows.
Do you have the
and there's
quote
a good
there?
segue into the Magian soul. Yeah. He says, in the Magian interior, the window is merely a negative component, a utility form in no way yet developed into an art form. To put it crudely, nothing but a hole in the wall. When windows were in practice indispensable, they were for the sake of artistic expression concealed by galleries, as in the Eastern Basilica. The window as architecture, on the other hand, is peculiar to the Faustian soul, and the most significant symbol of its depth experience. In it can be felt the will to emerge from the interior into the boundless. Interesting, actually. He also says, in terms of the theology of the Faustian soul, as compared to the classical concrete gods on Mount Olympus, like this concrete discrete place, versus the Magian,
Like deistic,
Christian, or Jewish or Islamic
Persian.
theistic god.
Mm.
Which is more, in some way, personalized and more enclosed. You've got the Faustian deistic god, which is everywhere at once, which has lost its,
which is infinite,
almost all of its human characteristics. It almost operates like a law or just a force.
Yeah,
it's indefinite. Or he uses the example of Valhalla, which looks more like a concrete place, but it's somewhere indefinite or somewhere everywhere. And if you die in battle, you go to this place / non-place. I should also say, I'm not sure if you did because I was away. The Faustian soul is Northern European. It's where it really evolved. He talks about it being a Germanic soul on a few occasions.
Yeah. That's maybe why he likes Goethe.
And
no?
so, yeah, it incorporates, say, Norse mythology as well.
Do you have a sense of why he liked Goethe so much? Is that how you pronounce it? I don't know if that's how you pronounce it.
So much.
Like, I don't know how to pronounce it. I think that's how you pronounce it, Goethe.
I think it's Goethe, but I mean, I also don't speak German.
Yeah, like, do you have a sense, because
he loves Goethe,
and Goethe is an instance of a Faustian literature? No, yes, no, it must be.
Well, Goethe did a lot. So I think he was a poet, naturalist, statesman. He was very optimized. he was a highly optimized individual. I mean, so with Spengler, I think so. Goethe, I've read very little Goethe. He liked the being and becoming stuff, and he called it living nature. What I think Spengler would call history. I think Spengler probably aesthetically likes Goethe, and Goethe said a bunch of things that Spengler just agrees with. At least that's my guess as to where the intense love of Goethe comes from.
So, what's an interesting comparison between like the Faustian and the Magian? Like you said, the windows before. Would you also like compare like the architecture and like the art styles? Like you have like Islamic art is very like pattern oriented. The Magian soul is like very metaphysically oriented, like spirituality oriented. And Magian cultures, there's only one Magian culture. So is it like, sorry, I might not understanding this. Is it like you have, even though you have like, say, like Persia and Arabic cultures, like Arabic cultures are like, when I say cultures versus like the Magian cultural soul, there's only one Magian cultural soul, but then you might have these like different cultures with a small c, like Arabic culture or Persian culture or like Judean culture. Yeah, is that a misrepresentation? Okay, so it's not a complete misrepresentation. So then, how is it that?
No, that's how I understood it.
How is it then that a Magian there's okay?
Wait, for listeners, the Magian soul arose
in the East
around, I guess, sort of around the year 0, thereabouts, and in the Middle East. And he calls it interchangeably the Magian or the Arabian soul. Important to note that when he says Arabian, he doesn't mean Arabic culture. Within the Magian soul, this includes sort of Persian, Jewish, Christian, post-classical, Manichaean religions. It includes Baal cults. It includes cults of Mithras. Includes a bunch of fire cults. And its prime symbol is the cavern. And I think we can understand the Magian soul by comparing it with the Faustian and the classical, particularly. So it has this sense of boundedness that's also present in the classical soul. However, where the classical boundedness emphasizes the surface of something, where there's no interiority and there's no ultimate exterior, the Magian cavern emphasizes interior space. So you've got space, but it's bounded within a cavern,
like a
outside
mosque.
of which nothing.
Like
is.
A mosque is like a good
and then
example.
Like the Faustian,
the dome of the rock.
Faustian also has this idea of existing in space, unlike the classical where you exist on this concrete surface. But the Faustian space is not bounded by a cavern. It's infinite. And then comparing those two, the Faustian and the Magian location in space is it's unlike the classical. It is a location in space, but it's relative to the cavern walls. Whereas the Faustian location in space is purely relative. You're just relative to something else that is in space, but you don't know where those two relative points lie in space relative to the container of space, because there is no container of space.
Would you almost
Space
call
goes
like
forever.
the idea of the firmament? Like you have the cavernous space, the firmament, and the cosmos.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's
Yeah.
interesting. I guess it's almost like you could say like it's like there's cultures and then there's like a meta culture. It's like this higher level. It's the soul is like it's like the highest level of abstraction above all these like more local souls. So it's almost like it's really interesting actually. More like a typology of it's like a typology of cultures.
So this part is definitely the schizo part of the schizo author's axis, because this is just making connections with everything. Just like reaching everywhere and making connections. But it's also really fun. This is a great part of the book.
It's really impressive because I can kind of see what he's talking about, but I don't I should caveat this with there might be a whole bunch of things within those particular cultures that contradict what he's saying that he didn't pay attention to, right? So
he could just be getting a bunch of stuff wrong.
And he could be making mistakes. But he's got enough here where he's laying on say architecture or literature or and it is interesting how he manages to correspond architectural styles to what mathematics are being used in a particular time and place or whatever.
Yeah, that's really fun.
And so you kind of get the sense of I sort of see what he's saying. There's this there might be this motif within a set of cultures where they this motif cuts across all these cultures, so we're going to group them into the Magian soul or something, or the Faustian soul.
Yeah,
in this very strange way.
I guess so. That idea, that central idea that there's some sort of abstract uniting force between different forms of cultural expression, I think there's something to it. But I do think cultures can influence each other, which he rules out. Quite explicitly rules out that possibility. I just don't think things are as discrete as he says they are.
So did you get a sense of how much further have you read? Have you read further than Macrocosmos 2? That's cool. Actually, that'd be a good name for some.
I've read a bit
album,
further. I've been reading Music in
2.
Plastic.
Yeah.
Macrocosmos.
Yeah.
There are a bunch of metal songs called Macrocosmos.
Yeah.
Actually.
Anyway,
I'm sure a bunch of metal bands have been inspired by Spengler.
Yeah, the penny hasn't dropped
or
for
at least
me
by his Wikipedia page.
with how these souls interact with one another. That's the thing that hasn't dropped to me.
The only way in which they do, and this isn't strictly a soul interacting with a soul, but a soul interacting with the actualized, made become of another soul, is in pseudomorphosis. And actually, while we're discussing the Magian soul, we can talk about pseudomorphosis, because this is
because we've mentioned that a number of times.
This is one of his examples of pseudomorphosis. So, pseudomorphosis is basically where you get a soul awakening sort of underneath the dead detritus of a former soul, underneath the actualized being of a soul which is now dead. So in the case of the Magian culture, the classical soul had died in the late Roman Empire, and what we call the late Roman style, where we see there seems to be some sort of resurgence in architectural and artistic and philosophical and political output, is actually because you have the springtime Magian soul awakening, so coming to life, this new vigorous soul that is actualizing itself in the world. But because it awoke in a world dominated by the actualized forms of the now dead classical soul, it takes those forms and starts using them. but it uses them with a completely different meaning, and that is pseudomorphosis. It's when a soul uses the forms of another soul to express something different. So, for example, because he loves columns, he froths at the fuck over columns. So you imagine in the classical world, columns were used to deny interiority, whereas in the pseudomorphosis of the Magian soul, you had these columns ordered against a wall. So instead of denying interiority in the Magian pseudomorphosis, they are denying exteriority. That's what he says. So to answer your previous question, I don't think two souls interact, or at least don't interact directly in terms of their becoming, but one soul can interact with the
become.
I think souls can interact with the being, with the actualized being of other souls.
Yeah.
An example of which is pseudomorphosis.
And is it only characteristic of they tend to do this during their decline, adopt, or is it that they can do it when they're awakening? Like, when the Romans did it, it was it they're imitating the Greeks because their culture is in decline.
I think so. With the Greeks and Romans, I think they were both of the classical soul.
Yeah.
So they're just, for whatever reason, that soul's destiny was to have these different small c civilizations, not capital C civilization, but small c civilizations. These different branches of it being actualized. But I think it was the same soul. Whereas with the Magian and the classical. So how depth is basic? It's this way
I must be misunderstanding this then.
of ordering experience, and so you get this raw input of experience, and it goes through the depth filter, and that makes actualities according to the destiny of the soul that is becoming. It's almost with the classical pseudomorphosis or the Magian pseudomorphosis. The world that it was actualizing into was full of these classical forms. So the actualized forms of this now dead soul, and it ran them through the Magian depth filter, and out of that came things that looked somewhat like the actualities of the classical soul, but they were imbued with a different meaning because of the Magian soul.
So the pseudomorphosis.
I catch myself saying this and realizing how schizophrenic it sounds. So I think it makes sense.
The pseudomorphosis is happening at the level of the soul, not of like specific civilizations necessarily. So like,
yeah.
So like the Greeks and the Romans were both classical civilizations. So therefore, a civilization can. Like, there's the civilizational stage of a culture, but the soul that's generating that culture could have multiple civilizations, is what I'm picking up here. But the soul itself can die.
Part of this is a terminology problem. It's like between the difference between capital C civilization and capital C culture, which are stages of a life cycle.
Yeah.
And then lower C culture, lower C civilization, which are like the meanings that we give to them in everyday speech. An actualizing soul can have multiple small C civilizations. Different different linguistic groups or something.
Yeah.
That are
like
actualized
the Romans
from
and the Greeks.
But it only ever has one culture and one civilization, in that the Greeks seemed to be the culture, and it turned into Roman civilization as the soul aged.
Okay. Whereas,
and then that died.
Okay.
So the soul was dead. Yeah, and you had the actualities from the dead classical soul that the springtime Magian soul started taking in and kind of digesting
Yeah.
and then actualizing, and that's the pseudomorphosis.
Okay, so that weirdly makes sense. I mean, like in a very strange, sort of way.
It's just complete moon logic.
Yeah. I wonder then, and this again, this is not really criticism. It's just a question that comes to mind. It's more like what does he think of things like, say, like Ptolemaic Egypt, like where it sort of like was it sort of Cleopatra, or maybe just like a bit before Cleopatra, like they started being like Egypt, late stage Egyptian empire was like kind of colonized by the Greeks, and like
I wonder if
what the interaction is there that's going on, because you've got this like late stage civilization that's in decline, like Egypt, but then you've got this thing that's in like the more vital earlier stage of like the sorry, which soul is it again? The Apollonian soul is like in ascent through the Greek culture, whilst the what's the Egyptian soul then? The Egyptian soul would be, we've got the Apollonian,
just Egyptian.
Yeah, just the Egyptian. So the Egyptian soul is in decline, and
it's just called the Egyptian.
Yeah, the Egyptian soul is in decline, whilst the Apollonian soul is in ascent. That's
really interesting.
And then because then the Roman civilization, which would be like the late stage Apollonian soul, did also completely like encompass Egypt as well. At which point would you say that maybe the Egyptian soul is completely dead, and it's just like the becoming is just like, that's the, as you said, like the word that you used before was detritus. The detritus of the dead Egyptian soul is just being like that. Is just being used now physically by the Roman civilization, by the late stage Apollonian soul.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know enough about Egyptian history. I know so little that I don't know if what I'm saying is historically accurate in a causal sense, but in the sense of destiny, perhaps. Maybe the Egyptian, then capital C civilization, was dying or dead, but its forms were in some way revitalized by pseudomorphosis of a living Greek culture using those forms for a new classical meaning.
Yeah. I mean, that's yeah. Because like you could even look at like
I'll take that.
Cleopatra married like a Greek general or something, right? And like, or am I fucking that history up? I feel like I'm fucking that up. Anyways,
was she fucking Mark Antony?
Yeah, both. I think there was an issue. Like she was like in bed with like one of the generals. I actually don't know.
I think I got that from Shakespeare, who was an infallible historical source.
Because those sorts of because then also
make things up.
You can also ask the same question of like what about when like Hannibal like entered into like India, and was it India or like, and that would have been like a Sumerian civilization interacting with, I suppose, the Apollonian. Yeah. And so I guess my question is really like, what's this interaction when these two, and they might be at different stages in their life cycle, but like, how do they? And so maybe this is a something that he'll answer later on, potentially.
Maybe,
but it's just interesting.
It's continuous pseudomorphosis in that. So I'm pretty sure within the Spenglerian context, those of different souls just cannot understand each other. Not fundamentally. So you can get some of the way towards understanding it, but not truly.
Yeah.
So maybe it's the interaction is pseudomorphosis. How they take in. So say with Orientalism as an artistic movement in the West, artists of the Western soul saw the artwork of East Asia and were inspired by it, and so took in those forms, but then used them to express fundamentally Faustian concepts in pseudomorphosis. Yeah, maybe the interaction between different souls is always pseudomorphosis.
Yeah, I mean, we're only up to chapter 6, so some of my questions might actually be answered later on, potentially. So that's why I'm not trying to frame them as criticisms. I just guess I think so. Definitely, what I would say is that pseudomorphosis is one type of interaction that can occur, or interplay that can occur. But are there like other ways in which they can interact with one another? Is something I'd be interested in. So let me look at the title of the next chapter. What's the next chapter called? The next chapter is like music and plastic, art form, soul, and then later on we've got a soul, image, and life feeling. And then we've got Faustian, Apollonian nature knowledge. Yeah, I have a feeling that like maybe some of my questions will be answered, or at least we might be able to extract some answers out of our later readings. Like when I say the chapter title of like,
what about we quickly
Apollonian,
run through
Faustian, like maybe he talks about that, the interaction between those two souls.
Yeah. What about we quickly run through the other cultures and their prime symbols, like the Egyptian? I think I mentioned earlier how their prime symbol was the way, it was a corridor, and they have an extremely historical world impression, so driving towards the future and being able to look back on the past as one would sort of back through a long corridor. I quote, "The Egyptian's existence is that of the traveller who follows one unchanging direction, and the whole form language of his culture is a translation into the sensible of this one theme. As we have taken endless space as the prime symbol of the North and body as that of the classical, so we may take the word way as most intelligibly expressing that of the Egyptians." And this was expressed almost all in stone, just something eternal for all time, an unchanging long corridor. And their art was all it never separated itself from architecture. So Spengler said that architecture is the sort of the prime art form of a culture's soul. It's the first one, the ordering and mathematization of space. And eventually, as a culture's soul gets older, in all cultures or in all souls except that of the Egyptian, you get ornamental arts that separate from architecture and begin to exist independently of it, but not in the Egyptian sense. All of their ornamental art was subordinate to architecture. So their pictorial art was
architectural,
was temple wall relief.
Yeah.
And it's always organized in a way that draws your gaze across the relief, as in a way, and leads down the temple corridors. And he says that as the Egyptian soul got older, it's almost the three-dimensionality of these reliefs flattened, and they tried to get it as close to purely two-dimensional as they could.
I have like random highlights here. Like, can I read one bit that I think maybe I don't know, it's just interesting. It's the Egyptian soul, conspicuously historical in its texture and impelled with primitive passion towards the infinite, perceived past and future as its whole world, and the present, which is identical with waking consciousness, appeared to him simply as the narrow common frontier of two immeasurable stretches. The Egyptian culture is an embodiment of care, which is the spiritual counterpoise of distance. Care for the future expressed in the choice of granite or basalt as the craftsman's materials, in the chiseled archives, in the elaborate administrative system, in the net of irrigation works, and necessarily bound up therewith care for the past. The Egyptian mummy is a symbol of the first importance. The body of the dead man was made everlasting, just as his personality, his, quote, ka, was immortalized through the portrait statuettes, which were often made in many copies and to which was conceived to be attached by a transcendental likeness. The Egyptian denied mortality. The classical man affirmed it in the whole symbolism of his cultures. yeah. Then I mean, I should just say, just like there's instances where there's just like a lot of highlighting, and I almost feel like when I'm doing that, it almost loses its ability to help me because there's just too much highlighting. Just like this is a random like stretch of like, but that was just a good example of like I think like, would you say his methodology of like pulling in, here's like a whole bunch of instances of this pattern expressed in like a cultural motif.
Yeah, and that's very characteristic of how he writes that quote. Or of his methodology.
So it's like he's saying, here's this soul idea, or like here's this soul, and here's something that it cares about, or like here's a primary axis of the soul's thinking, for lack of a better word, and then like here's how it expresses itself in a bunch of different like forms in the culture. So like the rejection of mortality and the obsession with the infinite takes its form in like the corridor and the mummification and the use of granite instead of something else. Like here's a whole bunch of ways. Yeah. So
yeah, I think that's what's going on.
Yeah, it's a wild ride.
Oh yeah. We've got the Chinese soul.
Yeah.
He keeps talking about the soul of the Chinaman or the Chinese soul.
You gotta smile when somebody speaks about the soul of the Chinaman.
It's the Tao.
The Tao, the I Ching.
So like the Egyptian soul, it's highly historical, but unlike the Egyptian soul's way, which is straight, it's a straight corridor, this is like wandering through a temple garden, and that's not the image I've come up with. That's Spengler.
yeah.
And he says actually for this reason, because nature guides the meandering Chinaman to the future, and as a result, the landscape features prominently in Chinese architecture and art, and gardening is a grand religious art in Chinese culture, but not in the actualities of other cultures' souls. And then there's the Russian soul, which Spengler, at the time of writing, he said the Russian style is still sleeping and is yet to find sure expression in religion or architecture. But the Russian prime symbol is a plane without limit, but it's a flat plane without limit. And one that, for example, in architecture emphasizes the roof as this flat thing, this flat plane. But the Russian style there's still pseudomorphosis with the Magian style, particularly the basilica from the Magian style. And while it's a pseudomorphosis, so unlike the Magian style, where, for example, the domed cupola emphasizes an interior space according to the prime symbol of the cavern, in the case of the Russian soul, emphasis is increasingly placed on the roof as something which emphasizes a flat plane, but it's still emerging. Okay, what have we? Symbol, we've gone over that. Macrocosm, actually. We can define macrocosm quickly. A macrocosm is basically the actuality of the sum total of all symbols in relation to one soul. Yeah, so that's macrocosm. Do you want to go into detail on imitation and ornamentation within the development of a soul's art?
I don't think I have the literal capacity to do that.
He spends a lot of time on it, but I'm just not sure how important it is. Maybe in a subsequent episode, it will become apparent that it's really important and we need to understand it. But at least so far, I found it interesting, but it's not hugely important. Maybe just really quickly, like in the context of a soul actualizing itself as art, you can have imitation or imitative arts or ornamental arts. Imitative arts are those that bring someone into sort of the same direction as the becoming of the soul that is actualizing itself into these arts. And this can be things like folk dances, oral poetic traditions, group song, things like that. Things that draw different people into a feeling of oneness. And these tend to be dominant in earlier stage in cultures, basically, capital C cultures. Ornamental arts are those where an individual impresses a symbol onto the world around them and makes it being. So while in imitative arts draw one closer to becoming, ornamental arts impose being upon the world. There's more I can go into, but I think that's just the main thrust of it.
Oh man, holy shit.
Yep, that's the Spengler experience.
I just feel like
just so alien to me.
Yeah, I think
It just feels like getting run over by a
for
truck
part 3. So this
until suddenly you just understand it.
I think this will if we're doing 3 chapters per, this is going to take another 2 episodes, right?
Yeah.
I'm going to have to like reread these first, because it feels as though like, yeah, I just like I've been conquered by Spengler. I think the first maybe 2, maybe 3 chapters, maybe 2 chapters in particular, like contain, like, now that we're getting further into the book, you can see the extrapolation that he's pulling from like the earlier in the book.
Yeah.
I feel like I almost will have to like go back, reread those for the next episode for it to hopefully set in.
I feel like getting a grasp, once I got a grasp of what soul and world were, being of proper and alien were, and being becoming history nature, everything that comes after is him just kind of stacking things on top of those. Do you want to keep going with stuff? Like, we can talk about the different style phases of a culture, like what its springtime, summertime, autumn, and winter basically look like. But we've also, I mean, that's sort of been implicit in what we've said this episode and last.
I feel like,
or it's been 2.5 hours and we could stop.
I feel like the coffee's fading and I am lacking enough confidence. This is the first book that's like given me enough enough of a beating, like since Evler, that I do need to go back and like read it properly. Read it like to a level where I feel like I've got my head around it. Or I still just don't feel like I've got my head around it. Yeah. So that's yeah.
It's just such a weird book. It's a really weird book.
This has been a humbling experience. Like, it's got these moments of like really interesting, like, for example, that Egyptian quote that I read before, or the one some of the quotes that Jack has read out, where you're like, oh yeah, that's really interesting, but then you're beating, like, there's just like this wall of text to like get through these like comparative and like, what would you say, associative thinking at times. Yeah, I think so.
I guess if anyone's listened this far, I guess here are my tips for reading Spengler or Evler for the few people who are still here at like 2.5 hours in. I found if I just have to leave what I actually believe at the door when I come into Spengler and just try to accept as truth what he's talking about, and then things start making sense. And just in terms of the mechanics of how I read it, like, I have a hard copy and I go through and make lots of notes and things and underline stuff in the margins of the book. And then I go back and make notes based on what I've underlined and the things I've written in the margins. Yeah. And I found, particularly when I'm going back over it to make notes on it, that's when things really start to make sense.
Yeah, this might not be amenable to like the digital approach. So, like, I've found that in the past when I've had a really hard book, I've had to like order the hard copy.
Yeah. I like scribbling all over books, and that's what helps me understand things.
Cool. So then should we put a pin in this particular episode? Do you reckon? So next episode, would we pick up from?
What do we got here? Next episode, we can do music. We can do Music and Plastic 1 and 2.
Yeah.
Then after that, we can do Soul Image and Life Feeling 1 and 2.
Yeah.
And then an episode after that can be Faustian and Apollonian nature knowledge.
Actually, I think that would be better
just our summary
to encapsulate those double chapters as single episodes rather than cutting across.
Yeah, you want to do that?
Yeah, I think that would be better. And also it's slightly shorter than trying to do 3 chapters.
Yeah. Okay. Next episode, I'm pretty sure, is on urine therapy as a natural addendum to Spengler.
I'm hoping that urine therapy will not hit me for 6 like I've been hit for 6 by Spengler.
I would be very surprised if urine therapy was considered really conceptually difficult. How hard can it be to learn why people drink their own piss?
It depends like what their writing style is like, because you could still turn that into like a Hegelian analysis of urine consumption or something like that. Like you could do it if you wanted.
The world spirit compels me to drink my own piss.
I wouldn't even be surprised if that actually exists.
Yeah, it might happen. And if it hasn't happened, either we can make it or generative AI gets good enough that we can just ask it to write us the phenomenology of spirit, but about drinking your own wee-wee.
I feel like we're attracting, by the law of attraction, we are, what's that word? Like actualizing. No. Manifesting. We're manifesting it.
We're manifesting what we want.
Time and spirit, except urine analysis. Okay, so should we should we wrap it up?
We'll
there?
have that. And then I think we have a My Little Pony episode.
Yep.
And then more Spengler.
Oh,
urine
man.
therapy, bronies, Spengler.
Oh, man.
No, yeah. Go.
Oh, my God.
Go together really well.
I just can't even. I just by the end of this year, I'm just going to be completely cooked. The ideas floating around in my head, trying to keep some semblance of sanity by doing like normal people stuff during the day.
It's the Levi pseudomorphosis, because while you're actualizing the exterior forms of normal people stuff, the inner motivating principle is that of urine therapy, My Little Pony, and Spengler.
We're really embodying the name of our podcast now. We said, what are you reading right now? Oswald Spengler's The Decline of the West, Urine Therapy, The Water of Life, and My Little Ponies. And recently, what else did we read? Furry Jack. Great.
Christian furry webcomics.
Yeah. Totally fried my brain. And in amongst there somewhere, we're going to read Tower.
Wow.
and hopefully that's the best of them. Look, if I rank you anything lower than second
this
out of all those books. This is a plug
for my fiction, in that these are the inputs. These are all the inputs, and then the output is my most recent
so
novel.
To be fair, when you started writing Tower, that was before we started the podcast.
Tower wasn't written, actually, when the book club from Hell was
it
a thing.
predates.
I did do later edits of Tower.
Yeah, so it's kind of like the basis was beginning. You put it in the oven before Book Club from Hell, but then when you took it out, you sort of like gave it some dressings and stuff with Book Club from Hell influences.
Yeah. Hypernormal, which is a manuscript I have that I want to get. No, I want to run by an editor.
Is that 100% book clubbed?
Maybe in a year or so.
You started development?
That's 100% book club.
So that one's going to be the weirdest. Then I assume.
I'm writing a manuscript at the moment, which has been not only completely written during Book Club from Hell, but the more mature Book Club from Hell soul.
Post-Evolian.
And that's in terms of actualities, that's the most influenced by the book club.
Yeah, I suppose if you write more and more books and we continue doing the book
The
club.
book club from Hell, World Soul.
I mean, there's so many questions here. Like, maybe I should save all of these questions for when we talk about your book being released. Yeah. Okay, let's do that. Because surely there's
okay.
Yeah.
Thanks for
Anyways,
listening, everyone.
We'll let you go. Thanks for listening.
Yeah. Thanks for listening.